10 messes own the sky over Bavaria. A lone Mustang breaks cloud cover 3,000 FT below. The rookie pilot has no wingman, no altitude advantage, no escape route. German radio traffic flares across the ether, confident, coordinated, closing fast. Then something impossible happens. The voices change. Urgency replaces certainty. One by one, the hunters fall away. The rookie disappears into weather they cannot follow. And the Luftwaffe controllers demand to know how a single American pilot just slipped through the most concentrated fighter screen in southern Germany. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. March 1945. The air war over the Third Reich has entered its final, most vicious phase. American heavy bombers strike deeper each day, and the Luftwaffe, battered but not broken, commits everything it is left to stop them. Fighter bases ring Munich, Augsburg, and Regensburg. Fuel is rationed, pilots are undertrained. But on certain days when the weather breaks and the bombers come, the Germans still rise in coordinated swarms. The 8th Air Force knows this. So does the 15th, pushing north from Italy. Escort doctrine has evolved into a science. Layered coverage, sector assignments, radio discipline. P-51 Mustangs fly top cover, while P-47 Thunderbolts sweep the deck. No one flies alone. No one breaks formation without cause. The rules are written in blood, refined over 3 years of trial and catastrophic error. But the rules assume experience. They assume pilots who have logged dozens of missions, who know the weight of combat in their bones, who can read a sky crowded with contrails and count the angles of survival in seconds. The replacement pipeline no longer guarantees that. By early 1945, some fighter pilots arrive at their squadrons with less than 300 hours total flight time. They know how to fly. They do not yet know how to survive. Second Lieutenant William R. Byer arrives at the 357th Fighter Group in mid-February, 22 years old. Mustang checkout complete. Combat missions flown, 0. His squadron mates brief him over coffee and cigarettes in a Quonset hut that smells of engine oil and wet wool. They tell him what the manuals do not: how to recognize the glint of a canopy in sunlight, how to clear your tail every 8 seconds, how to know when you are already dead and just do not realize it yet. Byer listens. He asks few questions. He writes nothing down. On March 7th, he flies his first mission. An escort run to an industrial target near Kassel. He stays in formation. He follows lead. He sees nothing but clouds and the aluminum glint of other Mustangs. The mission lasts 4 hours. When he lands, his hands ache from gripping the stick too tightly. No one mentions it. It is normal. The second mission is similar. The third brings flak. Black puffs blooming at 10,000 FT, random and indifferent. Byer learns what it feels like to flinch inside a cockpit, to trust sheet metal and prayer. On the 4th mission, he sees a Focke-Wulf 190 2 miles out, chasing a crippled B-17. Another Mustang rolls in first. The German breaks away. Byer never fires a shot. He is learning, but he is still a rookie. The 51st Fighter Group operates under the 15th Air Force, based at Lucena, Italy. Their area of operations includes southern Germany, Austria, and the approaches to the Alps. It is a killing ground. Mountains obscure radar. Clouds stack 15,000 FT deep. German controllers vector their fighters through valleys and over ridges, where American formations lose cohesion. The 357th has lost 4 pilots in 2 weeks. None of them had more than 8 missions. On the morning of March 17th, Byer is assigned to a long-range penetration mission, a bomber escort deep into Bavaria near the Austrian border. The target is an airfield complex at Neuburg and Adenau. Intelligence reports expect moderate to heavy fighter opposition. The weather forecast calls for broken clouds at 8,000 FT, solid overcast above 12. Visibility poor, icing possible. The briefing officer does not sugarcoat it. The Luftwaffe has been massing fighters in this sector. They are protecting jet bases, supply depots, and the last functional infrastructure of a collapsing regime. The Germans are desperate. That makes them predictable and extremely dangerous. Byer checks his gear, parachute straps, May West, escape kit, sidearm. He walks to his Mustang in the pre-dawn gray, breath misting in cold Italian air. The crew chief hands him a thumbs up. The engine turns over, smooth, strong, reliable. 50 gallons of fuel in the fuselage tank. Drop tanks slung under each wing. 6 Browning 50s loaded and charged. He runs through the checklist twice. Everything is green. Takeoff is staggered. 16 Mustangs from his squadron climb into the overcast and form up by radio and stopwatch. They head north, climbing through layers of cloud that swallow the formation in gray silence. At 18,000 FT, they break into sunlight. The sky above is sharp and blue. Below, the cloud deck stretches to every horizon, smooth and white as fresh linen. The bombers are already ahead. Silvery B-24 Liberators stacked in tight combat boxes, their contrails spreading behind them like chalk lines on a blackboard. The Mustangs slide into escort positions, high, low, and flanking. Byer flies in the second element, tucked in close to his flight leader. Radio chatter is minimal. The formation drones north. Somewhere near the Bavarian border, the clouds begin to thin. Patches of dark green earth appear below. Forests, fields, the pale thread of a river. Byer scans the sky. He checks his tail. He watches the other Mustangs for any sudden movement. Everything remains calm. The bomber stream continues north, steady and ominous. Then the call comes. Bandits. Hi. 11. So if this history matters to you, tap, like, and subscribe. Before the war, William Byer had never considered himself exceptional. He grew up in a small Pennsylvania town, where the loudest sound was the evening freight train and the brightest future was a job at the mill. His father ran a hardware store. His mother kept a vegetable garden. Life was ordinary, predictable, built on routines that stretched back generations. Byer was good at school, but not brilliant, friendly, but not popular. He played baseball in summer and read aviation magazines in winter, dreaming small dreams that felt large enough. When the war began, he was 17, too young to enlist. He watched his older brother leave for the army, watched the town empty of young men, watched the Gold Star flags appear in windows along Main Street. He graduated high school in 1942, and by then, the question was not whether to serve, but how. The Army Air Forces offered an answer that felt like destiny. He wanted to fly. The path to a fighter cockpit was long and ruthlessly selective. Byer enlisted in early 1943. He passed the physical. He passed the aptitude tests. He was sent to basic training, then classification, then pre-flight school. Everywhere he went, men washed out, too slow, too reckless, too unable to handle the pressure of formation, flying, or the physics of high-speed combat. Byer survived each cut, not because he was the best, but because he was consistent. He followed instructions, he learned from mistakes, he did not panic. Primary flight training came in Texas, open cockpit biplanes, and endless pattern work. He soloed after 8 hours. His instructor said he had good hands, smooth on the controls, no wasted motion. Basic training moved him to more powerful aircraft. He learned instruments, navigation, night flying. He learned what it felt like to push an airplane to its edge and pull it back before something broke. Advanced training brought him to the P-40 Warhawk, his first fighter. Heavy, aggressive, unforgiving of error. He learned to shoot, to dive, to recover from spins and stalls and simulated combat. He graduated in late 1944 with silver wings and a second lieutenant's commission. Then came the Mustang. The P-51 was faster, lighter, and more responsive than anything he had flown. It had range, climb rate, and the kind of performance that made experienced pilots grin, but it demanded respect. The Merlin engine ran hot. The laminar flow wing stalled sharply if mishandled. In a high-speed dive, control forces grew so heavy that some pilots could not pull out without trimming. First, Byer spent weeks learning its quirks, its limits, its personality. He came to trust it. The Mustang rewarded precision and punished sloppiness. That suited him. By the time he reached Italy, he had nearly 300 hours of flight time. On paper, that was enough. In practice, it meant he knew how to fly, but not yet how to fight. Combat added variables no training could replicate. The confusion of a sky filled with 40 aircraft. The distortion of speed and altitude. The adrenaline that turned seconds into hours and hours into seconds. The only way to learn was to survive long enough to learn. His squadron mates helped where they could. They taught him to scan in segments, not sweeps, to check 6 every 8 seconds, no exceptions, to never fixate on a single target, to trust his wingman and be worthy of that trust. They told him that most pilots who died in their first 5 missions died because they did not see the threat until it was too late. Situational awareness, they said, mattered more than gunnery. You could miss every shot and still come home. You could not come home if you were dead. Byer absorbed it all. He did not talk much. He listened, he watched. He replayed each mission in his mind, noting what he had done wrong, what he had missed, what had felt wrong, even if he could not articulate why. He was building an instinct, one flight at a time. But instinct took time, and time was the one thing no one could guarantee. The men around him were a mix of veterans and replacements. The veterans flew with a kind of weary competence, their movements economical, their voices calm on the radio, even when the sky turned violent. They had seen friends die. They had made mistakes and survived them through luck or skill or both. They carried that weight quietly, expressed in the way they checked their guns twice, the way they studied the weather, the way they said nothing at all when a new pilot asked a question that revealed how little he understood. The replacements were easier to read: nervous energy, bravado, covering fear, a desperate need to prove themselves, to belong, to not be the one who screwed up and got someone killed. Byer recognized it because he felt it. The difference was that he kept it to himself. He spent his off hours reading after-action reports. He studied German tactics, how they used sun and altitude, how they coordinated attacks, how they picked off stragglers, learned the profiles of enemy fighters, the 109's tight turn radius, the 190's roll rate, the way a Messerschmitt pilot would try to lure you into a climbing fight where the 109 had the advantage. He learned that the Mustang's strength was speed and energy retention, that you fought on your terms or not at all. But knowledge was not experience, and experience could not be rushed. On his 5th mission, Byer saw a B-24 go down. One moment, it was flying straight and level, tucked into the formation. The next, its wing folded back and the fuselage tumbled through space, shedding pieces and men. He counted 3 parachutes. The bomber carried a crew of 10. He forced himself to keep scanning the sky. There was nothing he could do. The mission continued. On his 7th mission, he fired his guns for the first time in combat. A Focke-Wulf 190 flashed across his nose at 1,000 yards, chasing another Mustang. Byer rolled, pulled lead, and squeezed the trigger. The vibration rattled his teeth. Tracers arced out and fell short. The 190 was already gone, disappeared into a cloud. Byer's hands were shaking. He flexed his fingers and resumed his position. He was learning slowly, incrementally. Each mission added another layer of understanding. Another fraction of a second shaved off his reaction time. But he knew he was still green. The veterans could feel it. The enemy could too. A rookie moved differently, scanned differently, flew just a little too tight or a little too loose. The Luftwaffe had been hunting American fighters for 3 years. They knew what inexperience looked like, and they knew how to exploit it. By mid-March, Byer had flown 9 missions. He had not scored a victory. He had not been hit. He was still alive, still learning, still trying to bridge the gap between training and competence. His squadron commander told him he was doing fine. His flight leader said to keep his head on a swivel. No one told him he was ready. No one had to. He would find out soon. Enough. The problem was not courage. The problem was mathematics. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest American air superiority in any sustained, meaningful way. Fuel shortages grounded entire wings. Pilot training programs had collapsed into rush cycles that sent teenagers into combat with barely enough hours to find the airfield, let alone fight. The industrial infrastructure that had once produced Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs by the thousands now struggled to deliver dozens. The war was lost, and everyone knew it. But knowing a war is lost and surrendering are not the same thing. The Luftwaffe had orders to defend the Reich, to bleed the bombers, to protect what remained of German infrastructure for as long as possible. Those orders produced a grim logic: concentrate whatever fighters were still operational, mass them at key choke points, and throw them at the American formations in coordinated waves. Trade losses for time, trade pilots for bombers, make the Americans pay for every mile. It was a strategy of desperation. It was also effective. American bomber losses had declined sharply since the dark days of 1943 when unescorted raids were slaughtered over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, P-47s, P-38s, and especially the P-51 Mustang changed the equation. By 1945, bombers rarely flew without fighter cover from takeoff to target and back. Losses dropped, confidence grew. The Air Force planned missions that would have been suicidal 2 years earlier. But escort duty was not simple. Fighters had to balance two conflicting priorities: stay close to the bombers to fend off attacks, or range ahead to intercept enemy fighters before they could dive on the formation. Stay too close and you surrendered the initiative. Range too far and you left gaps the Germans could exploit. The doctrine called for layered coverage, with some fighters flying high, some low, and some weaving back and forth along the bomber stream. It worked most of the time. When it failed catastrophically. The Germans had learned to watch for gaps. They tracked American formations from the moment they crossed the coast, using radar, ground observers, and radio intercepts to predict routes and timing. They positioned their fighters along likely approach corridors, waiting in loose formations at high altitude, invisible against the glare of the sun. When the opportunity came, when an escort group rotated out to refuel, when cloud cover disrupted cohesion, when a single flight drifted just a little too far from the main formation, they struck hard, fast, concentrated. The tactics were brutally efficient. A swarm of 4 messes would dive out of the sun, pick a straggler or a damaged bomber, make one high-speed pass, and climb back into altitude before the escorts could react. If the Americans gave chase, the Germans used their altitude advantage to dictate the engagement, forcing the Mustangs into vertical climbs where the 109s could outmaneuver them. If the Americans stayed with the bombers, the Germans reset and attacked again. It was a knife fight in a dark room. The Americans had more knives. The Germans knew the room. For rookie pilots like Byer, the challenge was compounded by inexperience. Veteran pilots could read the flow of a fight, recognize the setup before it happened, position themselves to counter or evade. Rookies saw chaos. By the time they understood what was happening, the Germans were already inside their decision loop. Reaction times that felt fast on the ground became sluggish at 400 Mempiskaus and 20,000 FT. Mistakes compounded. A momentary fixation on one target meant missing another. A delayed roll meant losing angle. A missed radio call meant separation from the flight, and separation meant death. The 8th Air Force had studied the problem extensively. Training programs emphasized mutual support, radio, discipline, and situational awareness. Doctrine stressed that a 2-ship element was the minimum survivable unit. Never fly alone. Never lose sight of your wingman. Never chase a single target out of the fight. The rules were clear, the logic was sound, but rules required enforcement, and enforcement required experience. A rookie might know the doctrine, but in the heat of combat, when the sky was full of smoke and metal, when tracers stitched past the canopy, when every instinct screamed to act, now knowledge became slippery. Training gave way to reflex, and reflex for a pilot with less than 10 missions was often wrong. The veterans knew this. They compensated by keeping rookies close, by calling out threats before the rookies saw them, by positioning themselves to cover mistakes. It worked mostly, but it added cognitive load. Every rookie in a formation was a potential liability, a weak point the enemy could exploit. The veterans accepted this because they had no choice. The replacement pipeline kept flowing. The missions kept launching. There were not enough experienced pilots to fly every sortie, so the rookies flew, and some of them learned fast enough to survive, but not all of them. On March 17th, the weather over southern Germany added another layer of complexity. The forecast had called for broken clouds, but the reality was worse. Solid overcast blanketed the region from 8,000 FT to well above 15,000. Visibility dropped to near zero inside the clouds. Ice formed on wings and canopies. Radio communication became garbled as formations climbed and descended through layers of moisture that scattered signals. For the bombers, it was merely uncomfortable. They flew by instruments locked in tight formations, trusting their lead navigators to bring them to the target. For the fighters, it was disorienting. Escorting bombers, you could not see through clouds where a wrong turn could send you into a wingman or into a mountain, required constant instrument cross-checks and radio coordination. The margin for error shrank and the Germans used the weather like a weapon. Luftwaffe controllers knew the cloud deck was thick. They positioned their fighters above it, waiting in clear air where they could see the contrails of the American formation as it emerged. They planned their intercepts for the moment of transition when American pilots were adjusting from instruments to visual flight, when formations were spreading out after climbing through the murk, when cohesion was weakest. Byer's squadron was assigned to high cover, which meant they would fly 2,000 FT above the bombers, weaving back and forth to clear the formation's flanks. The briefing had made it sound routine, but as the formation penetrated deeper into Bavaria, the tension in the radio calls began to change. Other groups were reporting contacts. Bandits at Tenzix, bandits breaking through the low cover, bandits climbing out of the clouds. The sky was full of Germans. Byer scanned continuously, eyes sweeping in segments. High, low, 6 repeat. His neck outsteht, his eyes watered from the glare. He saw contrails, sunlight, the white cotton of distant clouds. He saw other Mustangs, their polished aluminum skins flashing like mirrors. He saw the bomber stream below, a long, dark caterpillar inching across the landscape. And then he saw the glint high, 11 Siu, maybe 2's mig out. Small, bright, moving fast. He keyed his radio to call it out, but someone else was already talking. Multiple contacts, 9 scars, descending. Byer's flight leader broke left to intercept. Byer followed, pulling his stick smoothly, rolling into the turn, keeping his leader in sight. That was when everything fell apart. The German fighters did not come from one direction. They came from 3. Byer saw them now, dark shapes diving out of the high sun. Another group climbing out of a cloud bank to the east. A third group slashing across the bomber formation's nose. The radio exploded with calls. Mustangs broke in every direction. The neat geometry of the escort formation dissolved into a dozen individual dogfights scattered across 10 mi of sky. Byer's flight leader called for a hard left turn to engage a pair of Messerschmitt 109s lining up on a B-24. Byer rolled and pulled, his vision narrowing under G-forces, the horizon tilting sideways. He saw the 109s, sleek, predatory, closing fast. His leader fired a burst. The 109s broke in opposite directions. Byer followed the one that broke high. It was instinct, not strategy. The German pilot climbed steeply, using the Mess's excellent power-to-weight ratio to gain separation. Byer followed, pushing his throttle forward, watching the altimeter wind up 19, 20, thousands, 21. The 109 was pulling away. Byer nosed down slightly to gain speed, then pulled back into a climbing turn, trying to cut the angle. The Messes rolled inverted and dived back into the clouds. Byer hesitated. The doctrine was clear. Do not follow an enemy into clouds. You lose visual reference. You lose situational awareness. You become an easy target. But the German was escaping. Byer had him in sight. One more second and he could line up a shot. He pushed the stick forward and dived into the overcast. The world turned gray. Visibility dropped to 0. Byer transitioned to instruments, trusting his altimeter, airspeed, and attitude indicator. He descended through 2,000 FT of cloud, blind, hunting a target he could no longer see. His pulse hammered in his ears. The Mustang shuddered slightly in turbulence. He began a slow turn, hoping to reacquire the 109 on the other side of the cloud layer. He broke out at 7,500 FT. Below him, scattered forests and fields. No bombers, no Mustangs, no Messes. He was alone. Byer's stomach tightened. He leveled off and scanned the sky, turning in a slow circle, empty. He checked his compass and fuel. He had been in the fight for less than 10 minutes, but the maneuvering had burned through his reserves faster than expected. He still had enough to get home, but not enough to linger. He climbed back toward the cloud deck, intending to rejoin the formation. That was when he heard the call. American aircraft, unidentified, heading south at low altitude, possible straggler. The transmission was in German. Byer did not speak the language, but he understood the tone. The Germans had spotted him, and they were coming. He scanned again, faster now, eyes darting across every quadrant, there, high and to the west. Contrails, multiple aircraft descending. Bayer's mind raced. He was alone, low on fuel, with no altitude advantage and no support. The Germans were above him and closing. Running was the only option, but running where? He nosed down, accelerating toward the deck. The Mustang responded smoothly, speed building quickly. 200 knots, 250, 300. The ground rose up to meet him, fields, roads, a village flashing past beneath his wings. He leveled off at 500 FT, hedge-hopping, using terrain to mask his position. Behind him, the contrails followed. The Luftwaffe fighters did not dive immediately. They spread out, forming a loose net, trying to box him in. Byer counted the contrails as best he could. 8, maybe 10. All of them faster and higher, all of them coordinating. He broke hard left, then right. Weaving through a series of shallow valleys, the Germans split into pairs, each pair covering a different escape vector. Byer realized the trap. They were not trying to shoot him down immediately. They were hurting him, forcing him into a kill zone where one of them would have a clean shot. He needed an edge. The Mustang was faster than the 109 in level flight at low altitude. Byer knew that from training. If he could build enough speed to pull away, he might outrun them long enough to disappear. But extending required straight flight, and straight flight gave them an easy deflection shot. He had to make them commit. Byer spotted a ridgeline ahead, tree-covered and steep. He aimed for it, holding his course, letting the Germans close. The lead pair of Messers descended, lining up for a high-side pass. Byer waited. His airspeed climbed past 350. The ridge loomed closer. At the last instant, he pulled up and over, cresting the ridge with less than 100 FD of clearance. The Messes followed and hesitated. The trees were too close, the terrain too uneven. One of them pulled up sharply. The other tried to follow Byer through the gap. Byer dove down the other side of the ridge, using gravity to gain speed. He flattened out just above the treetops, the Mustang's engine roaring, the slipstream howling past the canopy. The Messmate pilot lost sight of him for 3 seconds. Long enough, Byer broke hard right, rolled inverted, and sliced into a narrow canyon between 2 forested slopes. The Messes overshot, pulling up to avoid the trees. Byer leveled out, now invisible below the ridgeal line, masked by terrain. He turned north, then west, changing heading every 30 seconds, staying low, staying fast. The contrails above him milled in confusion. He heard the German radio chatter again, angry, frustrated. They had lost visual, but they had not given up. Byer knew he could not hide forever. The Germans had altitude and numbers. Sooner or later, one of them would spot him again. He needed to get back into clouds, back into cover, where visual tracking was impossible. Ahead, a towering cumulus column rose from 8,000 FT to well over 20,000. Byer climbed toward it, trading speed for altitude, watching his fuel gauge tick lower. The Germans saw him climbing. 2 of them rolled in, diving to intercept. Byer pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Merlin engine screamed. The Mustang accelerated, clawing for altitude. The Messes closed from above, tracers flickering past Byer's wingtip. He reached the cloud base and disappeared inside. The world turned white. Byer flew on instruments, heart pounding, climbing blind through the murk. The Germans did not follow this time. They circled the cloud, waiting for him to emerge. But Byer did not. Emerge. He leveled off inside the overcast at 12,000 FT, throttled back to conserve fuel, and turned west. He flew by compass and clock, counting minutes, estimating distance. The clouds hid him completely. The Germans' voices faded from the radio, replaced by static and distant American calls. 10 minutes later, he broke out of the western edge of the cloud bank. Below him, the Alps. Behind him, empty sky. He was clear. Byer did not relax. He checked his fuel, enough to reach friendly territory, barely. He checked his engine temps, high but within limits. He checked his instruments, his radio, his position. He was alive. He was alone. And he had just done something no one had told him was possible. He had slipped through 10 German fighters and survived. The fuel gauge read 60 gallons. Byer calculated distance, airspeed, and consumption rate in his head. If he climbed, he would save fuel. If he stayed low, he would remain hidden. He split the difference, leveling off at 8,500 ft and A, leaning the mixture as much as he dared. The Mustang flew smoothly, its engine settling into a steady drone. The sky was empty now. No contrails, no flak, no bombers. Just open air and the jagged white line of the Alps stretching along the southern horizon. Byer followed his compass west, heading for the Italian coast. His hands were still shaking. He replayed the fight in his mind, analyzing every decision, every turn. He had made mistakes. Following the first messes into the clouds was a violation of doctrine. Separating from his flight was another. But he had also made choices that worked, using terrain, changing heading unpredictably, exploiting the Mustang's speed at low altitude. He had survived not because he was skilled, but because he had refused to do what the Germans expected. The enemy fighters had operated as a coordinated unit, spreading out to cover his escape routes, communicating by radio, herding him toward a kill zone. It was textbook Luftwaffe doctrine, what the intelligence briefs called the swarm tactic. Each pair of fighters supported the other, covering blind spots, maintaining energy advantage. It should have worked against a rookie pilot flying alone. It should have been decisive. But Byer had done something they did not anticipate. He had gone low, lower than the Germans wanted to follow, lower than their controllers expected, into terrain where altitude was a liability and speed was survival. He had traded altitude for concealment, energy for unpredictability. And when he needed altitude back, he had used the weather, those towering clouds the mission briefers had warned about, as cover. The Germans had the numbers. Byer had the initiative. It was not a tactic. It was improvisation born from desperation, but it worked. Byer thought about the radio calls he had heard, the German voices snapping orders and reporting positions. He did not speak the language, but the tone told him everything. Confidence at first, then irritation, then something close to disbelief. A lone American fighter outnumbered 10-1, had refused to be pinned down, had refused to fight on their terms, had simply disappeared. It bothered them. He could hear it in their voices. The realization gave him a flicker of satisfaction, quickly buried under exhaustion. He still had to get home. The fuel gauge continued its slow descent. Byer adjusted his course slightly, aiming for the most direct route across the mountains. He would cross the front line somewhere near the Brenner Pass, then follow the valleys down into northern Italy. If his calculations were correct, he would have 15 minutes of fuel to spare. If they were wrong, he would dead stick into a field and hope. The partisans found him before the Germans did. The minutes dragged. The landscape below shifted from forests to rocky slopes to snow-covered peaks. Byer scanned constantly, watching for fighters, for flak, for any sign of threat. The sky remained empty. The war felt distant, unreal, as if he had flown beyond its borders into some neutral space where only altitude and fuel and navigation mattered. He crossed the Alps at 9,200 ft, threading between two ridges, the Mustang's shadow flickering across snowfields below. On the southern side, the terrain softened into green valleys and winding rivers. Byer descended gradually, easing the Mustang down to 4,000 ft. The engine temperatures dropped. His breathing slowed. Ahead, a cluster of buildings appeared. An airfield, American markings visible on the runway. Byer checked his fuel. 20 gallons. Enough. He called the tower, identified himself, and requested immediate landing clearance. The controller's voice came back calm, almost bored, cleared to land, runway 27, wind light and variable. Byer entered the pattern, dropped his gear and flaps, and brought the Mustang down in a smooth, uneventful landing. The wheels chirped on concrete, the tail wheels settled. He rolled to the end of the runway and turned off onto the taxiway. The engine coughed once, sputtered, and died, out of fuel. Byer sat in the cockpit for a moment, staring at the instrument panel. His hands were numb, his back HD. His mouth tasted like copper. He popped the canopy and climbed out onto the wing, legs unsteady, and dropped to the ground. A crew chief jogged over, took one look at the empty fuel gauges, and whistled. "You glided in on fumes," Lieutenant Byer nodded. He did not trust himself to speak yet. The debrief took place in a cramped operations room that smelled of coffee and mimeograph ink. Byer sat across from the intelligence officer and recounted the mission. separation from the flight, the diving, messes, the low-altitude chase, the Germans boxing him in the escape into terrain and clouds. The officer took notes, nodding occasionally, asking for clarification on altitudes, headings, and numbers of enemy aircraft. When Byer finished, the officer leaned back and tapped his pencil against the desk. "You got lucky. Lieutenant," Byer said nothing. "You broke formation. You chased a single target into clouds. You ended up alone over enemy territory with 10 fighters on your tail. By all rights, you should be dead, or in a P camp. I know." The officer studied him. "But you made it back, and you did something smart. You used the terrain and weather to break contact instead of trying to dogfight your way out. That shows good judgment, even if the setup was poor." Byer exhaled slowly. "Will there be a report?" "There's always a report, but I'll note that you adapted under pressure. The brass likes that. Just don't make a habit of getting separated." Byer returned to his squadron the following morning. His flight leader was waiting. He did not look pleased. "You followed a 109 into the clouds." "Yes, sir." "What happened to the doctrine we briefed?" "I lost sight of you. I thought I could catch him before he escaped." The flight leader shook his head. "You thought wrong. You separated. You gave the enemy a free shot. If they had been better coordinated, you would not be standing here." Byer nodded. "Understood, sir." But the flight leader's expression softened slightly. "That said, you handled the situation well once you were in it. Most rookies would have panicked. You kept your speed, used the ground, and got yourself out. That takes presence of mind." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. Thank the fact that you fly a Mustang and not a Thunderbolt. You would not have outrun them at low altitude in a jug." The conversation ended there. Byer walked back to his quarters, exhausted, relieved, and oddly unsettled. He had survived, but survival felt less like victory and more like a warning. The margin between coming home and not coming home was thinner than he had imagined. Luck mattered, equipment mattered, but so did decision-making under pressure, the ability to adapt when everything went wrong. He had learned something over Bavaria. He did not have a name for it yet, but he knew it would matter again. The what? Intelligence reports filtered back through channels slowly pieced together from mission debriefs, radio intercepts, and German communications captured by signals intelligence units. By late March, analysts at 15th Air Force Headquarters had compiled a clearer picture of Luftwaffe tactics over southern Germany. The picture was troubling. The Germans had refined their interception doctrine into something ruthlessly efficient. They no longer attempted to contest American air superiority in broad daylight slugging matches. Instead, they concentrated their remaining fighters at key geographic choke points, mountain passes, river valleys, approach corridors to high-value targets, and used the terrain and weather to ambush isolated elements of American formations. The tactic relied on patience, coordination, and exploiting any moment of disorder. It worked. In the first 3 weeks of March, the 15th Air Force lost 14 fighters over Bavaria and Austria, most of them separated from their flights, most of them flown by pilots with fewer than 15 missions. The loss rate was not catastrophic, but it was rising and it was preventable. The answer was not more fighters or better aircraft. American equipment was already superior in nearly every measurable category. The P-51 Mustang outperformed the Mess's 109 in speed, range, and firepower. The issue was tactical: how to maintain cohesion in bad weather, how to prevent separation, how to ensure that rookie pilots understood the cost of chasing a single target into the unknown. Flight leaders began emphasizing terrain awareness in their briefings. Pilots were reminded that altitude was life, but terrain could be used defensively if altitude was lost. The goal was not to teach pilots to dogfight at treetop level. That was desperation, not doctrine, but to ensure they understood that survival sometimes required unconventional choices. If you were low, alone, and outnumbered, you did not dogfight. You ran, and you ran smart. Byer's debrief contributed to that shift. His escape was analyzed, broken down into principles that could be taught. Use terrain to mask your position. Change heading frequently to deny tracking solutions. Exploit weather, clouds, fog, low visibility as cover when visual combat became untenable. Maintain speed above all else. Do not try to outmaneuver a more agile aircraft. outlast it by forcing errors. None of it was revolutionary, but it was specific, grounded in a real example, and it gave rookie pilots a mental framework for a situation the training did not adequately simulate. You could practice formation flying. You could practice gunnery. You could not practice being hunted by 10 enemy fighters in unfamiliar terrain with no support and no altitude, but you could learn from someone who had survived it. By early April, the lessons were being disseminated to fighter groups across Italy. Flight leaders incorporated them into mission briefs. Pilots discussed them over evening card, games, and pre-flight walkarounds. The changes were incremental, undramatic, woven into the daily routine of combat operations. But they mattered. Fighter losses over Bavaria declined, not dramatically. Combat remained lethal, and the Luftwaffe still had skilled pilots and effective tactics. But fewer American pilots were dying from avoidable mistakes. Fewer were chasing single targets into bad situations. Fewer were separating from their flights and finding themselves alone over enemy territory. The numbers shifted just enough to notice. Byer flew 16 more missions before the war in Europe ended. He scored 2 confirmed victories: a Messmid 109 damaged on April 2nd and a Fowler Wolf 190 destroyed on April 21st. Neither engagement was dramatic. Both were quick, professional, and forgettable to everyone except the men involved. Byer did not talk about them. He did not seek recognition. He simply flew, completed his missions, and returned. He was no longer a rookie. The transition had no clear boundary, no ceremony. It happened in the accumulation of small competencies, knowing when to break without being told, reading the rhythm of a fight before it developed, trusting his instincts because his instincts were now built on experience. By May, younger pilots were asking him questions. He answered them the same way the veterans had answered his, clearly without embellishment, with a focus on what worked. The war ended on May 8th. Byer was in Italy, sitting on the wing of his Mustang, when the announcement came over the loudspeakers. Men cheered, fired flare guns into the sky, opened bottles they had been saving. Byer smiled, shook hands, accepted congratulations. But the relief he felt was quieter than he expected. He had survived. That was enough. He returned to the States in June, processed out of the Army Air Forces in July, and went home to Pennsylvania. He did not talk much about the war. When people asked, he said he had flown fighters in Italy. When they pressed for details, he deflected. The specifics felt too complicated to explain, too bound up in fear and adrenaline and decisions made in seconds that could not be translated into words over dinner. He went to college on the GI Bill, studied engineering, married a woman he met in a library, and built a quiet, unremarkable life. He worked for a manufacturing firm, raised 2 children, and retired at 65. He attended a few reunions with his squadron, exchanged Christmas cards with men whose names had once been shouted over radio frequencies in the midst of chaos. But mostly he moved forward. Decades later, a military historian researching 15th Air Force operations found a brief mention of Byer's mission in a declassified intelligence summary. The report noted his escape from multiple enemy fighters and his use of terrain and weather to evade interception. It included a recommendation that his debrief be circulated for training purposes. A footnote indicated that several subsequent mission briefings incorporated elements of his account. The historian tracked Byer down through veterans' records. He was 81 years old, living in a retirement community in central Pennsylvania. The historian called, explained his research, and asked if Byer would be willing to discuss the March 17th mission. Byer agreed. They met in a quiet room with large windows overlooking a landscaped courtyard. Byer's hands were spotted with age, his voice steady but soft. The historian asked him to recount the mission, and Byer did, haltingly at first, then with more detail as the memories returned. He remembered the clouds, the messes diving into the overcast, the moment he realized he was alone. He remembered the German radio calls, the contrails above him, the narrow canyon he had used to break line of sight. The historian asked if he had been afraid. Byer thought for a moment. Yes, but not the way you might think. I was too busy to panic. Fear came later after I landed. In the moment, it was just problem solving. Fuel, speed, terrain, heading. One decision after another. The historian asked if he thought his actions had made a difference. Byer shrugged. I came home. That was the difference. If my debrief helped someone else come home, then yes, I suppose it mattered. They talked for another hour. Byer described the Mustang's handling characteristics, the weather over Bavaria, the way the German fighters coordinated their attacks. He spoke with precision, his memory sharp on technical details, vaguer on emotions. When the historian thanked him and prepared to leave, Byer stopped him. "There is something I want to say." The historian waited. Byer looked out the window, choosing his words carefully. People think war is about heroism. It is not. It is about young men trying not to die while doing a job no one should have to do. I was not brave. I was scared and stubborn. I survived because my airplane was good, my training was adequate, and I got lucky, that is all. The historian nodded. "But you adapted. You made decisions under pressure. That counts for something." Byer smiled faintly, maybe. But the men who did not come home made decisions too. They were just as smart, just as trained. The difference was inches and seconds. I do not want to be remembered as someone special. I want people to understand that war is random, brutal, and wasteful, and that survival is not a validation. It is just survival. The interview ended. The historian included Byer's account in a book published 3 years later, a detailed study of air combat tactics in the final months of the European War. Byer received a copy. He read it once, then placed it on a shelf and did not open it again. He died in 2003 at the age of 86. His obituary mentioned his service as a fighter pilot in World War II, but gave no details. A small funeral was held. His children spoke about his kindness, his work ethic, his love of crossword puzzles. No one mentioned the mission over Bavaria. No one recounted the chase, the clouds, the moment he disappeared from the German fighter view, but the lessons endured. Training manuals written in the decades after the war incorporated principles refined from debriefs like his: terrain masking, speed management, weather exploitation. Fighter pilots in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond learned tactics that had roots in the improvised decisions of men like Byer, who had faced impossible odds and survived by thinking faster than the enemy could react. The mission itself faded into obscurity, one among thousands flown in the final months of a vast and terrible conflict. No medals were awarded, no dramatic retelling made it into popular history. It was too small, too technical, too specific to capture the public imagination. But in the quiet archives of military aviation, in the syllabi of fighter weapons schools, in the unspoken knowledge passed from experienced pilots to new ones, the lesson remained. When everything goes wrong, when you are alone and outnumbered and the odds are impossible, you do not give up. You adapt. You use what you have: speed, terrain, weather, wits. You make the enemy react to you instead of the other way around. You refuse to fight on their terms. And sometimes, if you are skilled and lucky and stubborn enough, you slip through. Byer never claimed to have invented anything. He insisted he had simply done what seemed logical at the time. But logic under pressure, clear thinking in chaos, the ability to adapt when doctrine fails. These are not common. They are learned and they are taught by example. One rookie pilot over Bavaria, outnumbered 10-1, found a way home. In doing so, he proved that survival was not just a matter of firepower or numbers. It was a matter of will, creativity, and the refusal to accept the terms of the fight as given. That lesson did not end with the war. It echoed forward, shaping the way fighter pilots understood their craft, their risks, their responsibilities, not as heroes, but as professionals navigating the chaos of combat with whatever tools they had. In the end, that was Byer's legacy. Not fame or glory, but a small, enduring contribution to the art of survival. A reminder that in the worst moments, when the sky is full of enemies and the fuel gauge reads empty, the mind remains the sharpest weapon. And sometimes that is enough. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.